At 1:15 in the morning on February 28, 2026, a man in Tehran went to sleep believing he was protected. His name was Mohammed Pakpour. He was the commander-in-chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. He controlled the most powerful paramilitary organization in the Middle East. He slept inside a hardened compound that had been built specifically so that no external force could reach him without warning. He did not wake up. Not because an army arrived at his gates, not because a commando team breached his perimeter. He did not wake up because the American intelligence architecture had been tracking the electronic signature of his command compound for months, with the specific patience of a system that does not announce itself until the announcement is the explosion. And the explosion came before the warning was even possible. That is not a military story, that is an engineering story. And the engineering is what this script is about. The mainstream coverage of what happened in the opening hours of Operation Epic Fury described it as a military strike campaign. That description is technically accurate and analytically insufficient. What happened in the first 45 seconds of the operation was something more precise and more consequential than a strike campaign. It was the operational execution of a plan that the Pentagon had been constructing for years under a classification level that the public documents call a planning framework, but that the people who built it called something else. They called it Ghost Strike. And what Ghost Strike achieved in those 45 seconds rewrote the relationship between a hardened underground command infrastructure and the weapons designed to reach it permanently, and in ways that the Iranian security establishment is still calculating the full weight of today. Let that specific framing land before we proceed. Because everything that followed, the B-2 bombers launching from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, the 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators burrowing through 200 feet of reinforced concrete in Tehran's Jamaran district, the simultaneous severing of IRGC communications infrastructure by U.S. Cyber Command before a single bomb was dropped, the killing of over 40 senior Iranian military and government officials in the first operational hour, all of it traces back to the specific intelligence architecture that made targeting possible with the precision that 45 seconds implies. Not minutes, seconds. To understand what Ghost Strike actually was, you need to understand the problem it was designed to solve. And the problem is one that military planners have been studying since the first underground bunker was ever built by any adversary who understood that concealment is the only defense against a superior air force. The IRGC did not build its command infrastructure on the surface. It built it underground. The decision was not improvised. It was the institutional conclusion of an organization that had spent 4 decades studying what American air power does to surface infrastructure and building the specific countermeasure that American air power cannot easily defeat. Concealment. You cannot strike what you cannot locate with confidence. And an adversary who disciplines itself over 20 years to maintain electronic silence, to route communications through redundant underground fiber rather than radio frequency emissions, to house its senior commanders in facilities that produce no thermal signature detectable from orbit, creates a targeting problem that conventional intelligence collection cannot solve by conventional means alone. The IRGC understood this. They had watched what happened to Saddam Hussein's command infrastructure in 1991. They had studied the targeting methodology that American planners used to map and destroy above-ground Iraqi command nodes in hours. And they concluded, with the specific institutional discipline that a revolutionary organization whose survival depends on correct threat assessment is capable of, that the answer to American air power supremacy was not a better air defense system. It was a deeper hole. They dug for 20 years, tens of billions of dollars. Kilometers of reinforced concrete tunnels beneath Kish Island, beneath Tehran, beneath the coastal terrain of Bandar Abbas, beneath the Jamaran district where the IRGC's most sensitive command infrastructure was eventually concentrated. The underground missile cities were not metaphorical. They were specific engineering achievements. Facilities designed to withstand conventional munition strikes. Facilities designed to continue operating under sustained bombardment. Facilities designed to give IRGC commanders the specific operational continuity that surface command infrastructure could not provide when American F-35s were in the airspace above them. And for years, the strategy worked, not in the sense that the IRGC was never pressured or that its surface assets were never struck. The strategy worked in the specific sense that the underground command infrastructure remained operationally intact through every previous military and diplomatic pressure campaign that the United States and Israel applied. The Fordo enrichment facility survived for years, specifically because its depth made it a targeting problem that no available conventional munition could solve. The IRGC command bunkers beneath Tehran survived because no available intelligence collection architecture could locate and characterize them with the precision that targeting requires. Now understand what Ghost Strike changed and why the change is not reversible. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator is the specific engineering answer to the specific engineering question that the IRGC's underground construction program posed. It weighs 30,000 pounds. It carries a 5,300-pound explosive warhead inside a hardened steel casing engineered to survive the penetration process that delivers it to its detonation depth. It uses GPS and inertial guidance to navigate to its target with a precision that distinguishes a weapon from a projectile. And it is designed to penetrate up to 200 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. Not 20 feet, not 50 feet. 200 feet of the specific concrete geometry that an adversary builds specifically to defeat bombs. The weapon was developed over 15 years by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, specifically because adversaries like Iran were building exactly the kind of underground infrastructure that conventional munitions could not reach. It was first operationally employed in June 2025 during Operation Midnight Hammer, the U.S. strike campaign against Iran's nuclear facilities at Fordo and Natanz, where 14 GBU-57 bombs were delivered against the specific structural elements, the ventilation shafts, the reinforced concrete caps, the underground access corridors that made those facilities functional. The attack sequence required the initial weapons to breach the ventilation infrastructure before subsequent weapons could reach the facility depths. It worked. The facilities were destroyed. The IRGC drew the correct conclusion from Operation Midnight Hammer. They understood that the GBU-57 had broken the equation that their underground construction program was built on. The depth that was supposed to make their facilities invulnerable had been addressed by a weapon specifically engineered for that depth. What they did not yet understand, or what they understood but did not believe the Americans would be willing to execute, was that the operational deployment of the GBU-57 against command infrastructure, rather than nuclear infrastructure, required a different kind of intelligence preparation. And that intelligence preparation had already been completed before February 28, 2026. This is where Ghost Strike becomes something more than a weapons story. The intelligence collection architecture that made the opening strikes of Operation Epic Fury possible did not begin when the first bomb was dropped. It began years earlier in the specific, patient, unhurried way that American signals intelligence, satellite reconnaissance, and human intelligence collection operates when it is given a strategic priority target and told that the timeline is not days or months, but years. The targeting database that the B-2 bombers used on the morning of February 28th was not assembled the night before. It was assembled through a continuous collection effort that tracked electronic emissions, mapped tunnel entrance geometry from satellite imagery, characterized the communication patterns that revealed command node locations, and built the specific target packages that turned intelligence into weapon delivery coordinates. Joint Chiefs of Staff. Chairman General Dan Kane described the opening operational sequence at a Pentagon press conference with the specific directness that the moment required. The first movers were U.S. Cyber Command and U.S. Space Command, he said. They began layering non-kinetic effects to support the mission, disrupting and degrading and blinding Iran's ability to see, communicate, and respond. Coordinated space and cyber operations effectively disrupted communications and sensor networks across the area of responsibility, leaving the adversary without the ability to see, coordinate, or respond effectively. Read that again, slowly. Before a single kinetic weapon was delivered, before any bomb fell, before any missile arrived, the IRGC's communications infrastructure was severed. Its command nodes were isolated from each other. Its early warning systems were blinded. Its electronic backbone, the specific network architecture that allowed a commander in a bunker in Tehran's Jamaran district to coordinate with a missile battery in Tabriz or a naval unit in Bandar Abbas, was disrupted at the network layer by cyber command operations that had been penetrating and mapping that infrastructure for months in advance of the kinetic phase. The Financial Times reported that one Israeli cyber operation specifically targeted the mobile communications towers in the immediate vicinity of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's location, flooding them with traffic that made phone communication impossible and preventing any warning from reaching his security detail before the strike arrived. The technology was not experimental. The application was not improvised. The specific disruption of the mobile communications architecture in a defined geographic radius around a specific high-value target was the operational execution of a collection effort that had characterized that communications environment in advance with enough precision to execute selective denial against a defined area while leaving surrounding infrastructure nominally functional. This is what makes the 45-second framing operational rather than rhetorical. When U.S. Cyber Command executed its disruption of IRGC communications infrastructure before the kinetic phase began, it created a window in which the IRGC's distributed command network could not coordinate, could not warn, could not direct air defense assets, could not communicate the fact that something was happening before what was happening was already complete. The weapons arrived inside that window. The targets were struck before the communications infrastructure could be restored. The 45 seconds is the specific operational compression that cyber and kinetic integration produces when the intelligence preparation has been done correctly. Mohammed Pakpour did not receive a warning because the warning could not be transmitted. Ali Shamkhani, the Secretary of the Defense Council, was killed because the mobile communications disruption around his location prevented his security detail from coordinating a response before the strike arrived. Mohammed Bagheri, the Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces, was killed because the command network that might have provided advance warning had been severed by the non-kinetic first movers before the kinetic weapons reached their terminal phases. Over 40 senior Iranian military and government officials were killed in the first operational hour because the intelligence architecture that had been building for years was executed against the targeting database it had constructed with the specific speed that the communications disruption window made possible. Now understand the specific people whose lives ended in that 45-second window and what their deaths meant for the 90 million people living under the institutional infrastructure they controlled. There was a man named Ahmad. He is 34 years old. He lives in a modest apartment in Tehran's Narmak district with his wife Farideh and their 2 children. Ahmad worked for a logistics company that supplied materials to several IRGC-affiliated construction projects. He did not choose that work for ideological reasons. He chose it because it paid reliably in a country where reliable payment had become rare. On the morning of February 28, 2026, Ahmad's phone went dead. The internet service his family depended on disappeared. The state television that his elderly mother had running in the next room showed static, and then a test pattern, and then nothing. He did not know what was happening. What he could not know was that the specific institutional architecture that had made his work possible, the command structure that funded the projects, that funded his employer, that funded his salary, was being eliminated compound by compound, bunker by bunker, with a precision that the engineers who built those compounds had specifically believed was impossible. Ahmad's story is not separate from the military story. It is the human infrastructure that the military infrastructure sustains. And when the military infrastructure is struck with the specific comprehensiveness that Ghost Strike achieved in its opening phase, the ripples reach Ahmad's apartment in Narmak, not through news, because the news was also disrupted, but through the specific silence that fills a city when its power grids flicker and its communications go dark, and the ordinary institutional machinery that moves money and goods and services quietly stops moving. Let us return to the weapons, because the weapons are the specific mechanism through which the human consequences are produced. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber is the only aircraft in the world capable of delivering the GBU-57. The constraint is not arbitrary. The GBU-57 weighs 30,000 pounds. The internal weapons bay geometry and payload capacity required to carry that weapon, while maintaining the low observable aerodynamic profile that makes the B-2 a viable penetrator of defended airspace, exists in no other platform. The B-2 can carry 2 GBU-57 bombs internally. It can launch from White Man Air Force Base in Missouri, transit to target, deliver its weapons, and return. The round-trip mission from Whiteman to Tehran and back is approximately 36 hours of flight time with refueling support. It requires the sustained coordination of aerial refueling aircraft, intelligence and surveillance assets tracking the target continuously, and the specific crew endurance that strategic bomber missions demand. On April 3, 2026, CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper received time-sensitive intelligence that a large concentration of senior IRGC commanders had gathered inside an underground command bunker in Tehran's Jamarin district. The intelligence was specific enough to characterize the number of personnel present and specific enough to provide the targeting coordinates that the GBU-57 delivery required. Admiral Cooper made the decision to strike, not as a pre-planned event in the campaign schedule, as a dynamic targeting decision executed against a time-sensitive opportunity. B-2 bombers were ordered from Whiteman Air Force Base. The round-trip mission was launched. The GBU-57s reached the Jamarin bunker. The facility was obliterated. The sources who described the strike to Fox News used a specific word. They said the bunker was obliterated. Not damaged, not degraded, obliterated. The Wall Street Journal confirmed the strike. The national interest confirmed the specific weapon employment. Iranian state media's initial response was to deny the strike had occurred. Its subsequent response, when the denial became operationally unsustainable, because Iranian officials in the area could see with their own eyes what the weapon had done to the facility, was to claim the strike had missed its target. The physical evidence, characterized by satellite imagery and confirmed by multiple independent reporting sources, indicated otherwise. Now understand what the specific sequence of the April 3rd strike means in operational terms that the public framing of the event has not fully conveyed. The IRGC had spent 20 years building the argument that its underground infrastructure was invulnerable to American conventional weapons. Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025 addressed the nuclear facilities at Fordo and Natanz and demonstrated that the GBU-57 could reach depths that the facility's designers had calculated were safe. The IRGC's response to that demonstration was not to abandon underground construction. It was to reassess the specific depth parameters and to assume that command infrastructure at greater depths or under different geological profiles might still be protected. The April 3rd strike on the Jamaran bunker destroyed that assumption. Not theoretically, operationally. The specific IRGC command facility that had been built to survive conventional munition strikes was struck by the GBU-57 and obliterated. The commanders who were inside it when the weapon arrived did not survive. The institutional conclusion that the IRGC was forced to draw from this operational evidence was the most psychologically devastating conclusion an underground-dependent military organization can be forced to draw. Depth is not protection. The weapon reaches, and the weapon reaches with enough energy after penetration to destroy what it finds. This is the specific mechanism through which Ghost Strike achieves what every previous pressure campaign against Iran could not achieve. Sanctions create financial pressure, but leave the institutional infrastructure intact. Diplomatic pressure creates negotiating dynamics, but does not address the physical command architecture that makes defiance operationally viable. Limited military strikes create specific damage, but leave the underground command nodes that direct the response intact. Ghost Strike addressed the underground command nodes directly with the specific weapon designed for exactly that purpose and the specific intelligence architecture needed to locate and characterize those nodes with targeting precision. Let us talk about the specific sequence that produced the intelligence. The ISR architecture that enabled Ghost Strike is not one collection system. It is a layered integration of systems that each contribute a different type of information to a combined picture that is more complete than any individual collection system could produce alone. Sentinel-2 satellite imagery provides persistent optical reconnaissance at resolutions sufficient to characterize surface infrastructure changes that indicate underground facility construction or modification. AWACS aircraft provide continuous radar surveillance of airspace and surface movement patterns. EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft collect and characterize electronic emissions from IRGC communications and radar systems. Human intelligence networks provide the specific interior characterization, personnel presence information, meeting schedules, that no technical collection system can produce independently. The integration of these collection systems over the years of preparation that preceded February 28th produced the targeting database that made the opening strike sequence possible. The 1,250 targets that U.S. and Allied forces struck in the first 48 hours of Operation Epic Fury were not identified in the weeks before the operation began. They were identified, characterized, and assigned weapon delivery solutions over a period of years, continuously updated as the target infrastructure changed, and packaged for delivery against the specific weapon systems and platforms that the operational plan designated for each target category. The IRGC's 20-year investment in electronic silence was partially effective. It reduced the volume of electronic emissions that signals intelligence could characterize. But electronic silence is a discipline, not an absolute. Every time an IRGC commander communicated with a subordinate command node through a system that produced any electronic emission, that emission was collected. Every time a radar system was activated to track a surveillance aircraft, the emission was recorded. Every time a command network conducted a communication test to verify connectivity, the test produced intelligence. The discipline reduced the collection opportunity. It did not eliminate it. And over years, the partial collection built into the complete targeting picture. The cyber penetration that preceded the kinetic phase was itself an intelligence collection effort. U.S. Cyber Command's operations inside IRGC communication networks did not begin when it was time to sever those networks. They began when it was time to map them. The same network access that eventually enabled the disruption of IRGC communications on the morning of February 28th was used in the preceding months to map the network topology, identify the command nodes, characterize the communication patterns that revealed which facilities were operationally significant, and provide the human intelligence networks with targeting cues that allowed physical surveillance to confirm what the technical collection had characterized. Now understand why the specific detail of the Khamenei communications disruption matters beyond its tactical application. The Israeli cyber operation that targeted mobile towers around Khamenei's location was not executed to prevent a phone call. It was executed to confirm that the intelligence characterizing Khamenei's location was accurate enough to build a disruptive operation around. The specific geographic targeting of mobile communications disruption requires knowing with enough precision where the target is to define the disruption radius. The fact that the disruption was executed successfully means the location intelligence was accurate. The fact that it was executed as part of a coordinated opening sequence means it was integrated into the overall targeting plan rather than improvised. The mobile tower disruption was confirmation intelligence. It demonstrated, in the execution, that the months of collection had produced an accurate picture of where Khamenei was on the night of February 28th. He was killed by the strike that arrived before any warning could be transmitted. His death was confirmed by Israeli officials on day 1 of the operation. The Islamic Republic that he had led for decades was suddenly in succession crisis, with competing factions within the clerical establishment and the IRGC fighting for institutional control at the precise moment when the military infrastructure those factions depended on was being systematically destroyed. Now understand the human dimension of what the succession crisis produced and why it matters for the 90 million people living under the system that was fracturing. There is a woman named Mariam. She is 61 years old. She lives in Mashhad. Her son Reza is a mid-level IRGC officer, not a senior commander, not a political figure, but a career military man who joined the IRGC because in the Islamic Republic, the IRGC offered career stability and social status that civilian employment in a sanctions-constrained economy could not provide. Reza received no orders on the morning of February 28th because the communications infrastructure that would have delivered those orders was severed before any order could be transmitted. He did not know if his commanding officer was alive or dead. He did not know what the operational situation was. He knew only what he could observe from his immediate surroundings, which was that the communications had gone dead, the internet was down, and the distant sounds he heard were not exercises. Mariam did not sleep that night. She tried to call Reza and could not reach him. She tried to access news and found nothing but static. She sat in her apartment in Mashhad with the specific terror of a mother who knows her son is in the military and cannot reach him and cannot find out why. That terror is not a strategic abstraction. It is the specific human consequence that military operations produce beyond their immediate kinetic effects. The disruption of IRGC communications that made Ghost Strike operationally successful was experienced by Mariam as the specific silence that replaced her son's voice when she tried to call him. And that silence lasted for days. There's a third person whose story matters here. His name is Darius. He is 47 years old. He's a petroleum engineer who worked at the Karg Island oil export terminal, the facility through which approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports have historically flowed. He has worked there for 19 years. He knows every pipe, every pump, every loading arm on that terminal with the specific intimacy that nearly 2 decades of daily operational responsibility produces. On the morning of February 28th, Darius arrived at work and found the facility on emergency shutdown protocol because the communications infrastructure that connected the terminal's operations to the IRGC-affiliated security command network had gone dark overnight. He did not know why. He tried to call the command center and could not reach anyone. He tried to call the Ministry of Oil and found the same silence. He stood on the loading dock watching tankers that had been scheduled to load that morning sitting motionless in the water because no one had authorization to begin loading operations when the authorization chain had gone dark. Darius's tankers sitting motionless is not an abstraction. It is the specific physical mechanism through which Ghost Strike's disruption of IRGC communications produced the oil revenue collapse that the SNSC's leaked assessment was documenting. Every tanker that did not load that morning was oil revenue that did not flow. Oil revenue that did not flow was money that did not reach the IRGC's financial infrastructure, the government's subsidy programs, the salaries of Darius's own colleagues, the pharmacy where Mariam's elderly mother bought her heart medication, the bakery where Ahmad's wife Farideh bought the bread that was already becoming more expensive. The petroleum engineering clock that ran down and forced the deal began its count down the eye. Morning Darius's tankers sat motionless because the authorization chain had been severed in the 45 seconds that Ghost Strike's opening phase required. Let us return to the operational picture, because the operational picture is what determines whether Mariam's silence is temporary or permanent. The June 10th, 2026 strikes were the second consecutive day of direct U.S. military action inside Iranian territory, according to CENTCOM's own statement. The strikes targeted IRGC command and control centers, air defense systems, military communications, networks, and missile storage facilities. CENTCOM described them as self-defense actions aimed at neutralizing threats posed by Iranian military capabilities to U.S. personnel and international commercial shipping. The strikes followed the reported downing of a U.S. Army AH-64 Apache helicopter by Iranian forces earlier in the week, which itself followed the continued IRGC operations that the nominal ceasefire framework had not fully stopped. The June 10th strikes were not the beginning of something new. They were the continuation of a campaign architecture that had been operating against the specific target set that Ghost Strike defined from the opening night of Operation Epic Fury. IRGC command and control, communications networks, missile storage, air defense systems, the specific categories of infrastructure whose elimination degrades not just the IRGC's kinetic capability, but its institutional ability to coordinate, direct, and sustain the proxy network architecture that represents 40 years of revolutionary investment in regional influence. By March 15, 2026, over 6,000 IRGC members had been killed and approximately 15,000 wounded since the start of Operations Epic Fury and Roaring Lion, according to the Jerusalem Post, citing intelligence assessments. 300 mobile missile launchers had been destroyed in the first 72 hours, reducing the volume and salvo size of Iranian missile attacks. 92% of large Iranian Navy surface combatants had been sunk or disabled. The IRGC Navy commander, Admiral Alireza Tangsiri, was killed in a precise Israeli strike in Bandar Abbas. The Khatam al-Anbiya Emergency Headquarters, the operational coordination center that reports directly to Iran's supreme leadership, had two of its senior intelligence officials, Abdullah Jalali Nasab and Amir Shariat, eliminated in a targeted killing in Tehran. These are not statistics. They are the specific institutional losses that an organization built on centralized command and decades-long relationship networks cannot replace quickly, if at all. The IRGC that existed on February 27, 2026 was an institution whose senior leadership knew each other, had operated together through the Iran-Iraq War, had built the proxy networks together, understood the institutional relationships and operational tradecraft that made the organization function. The IRGC that exists today is an organization whose senior leadership layer has been systematically removed and whose replacement generation lacks the specific operational experience that the eliminated commanders possessed. This is the dimension of Ghost Strike that the military analysis focused on weapons and targets and battle damage assessments has not fully captured. Military capability is not just hardware. It is institutional knowledge. It is the specific operational experience that allows a commander to assess a situation correctly and respond with appropriate speed and judgment. The F-35 that destroyed the radar system at Bandar Abbas did not just eliminate a piece of equipment. It eliminated the trained personnel who understood how that system integrated with the broader air defense network. The B-2 that obliterated the Jamaran bunker did not just destroy a facility. It eliminated the commanders who understood the specific operational relationships between the IRGC's various commands in ways that no document or communication recording can fully replicate. Now understand the specific consequence of that institutional knowledge lost for the proxy networks, whose maintenance requires their relationship-based coordination that the eliminated commanders provided. The IRGC's relationship with Hezbollah was not managed through formal bureaucratic channels. It was managed through personal relationships between IRGC officers and Hezbollah commanders that had been built over decades of shared operational experience. The elimination of the IRGC officers who held those relationships did not just disrupt the financial flows to Hezbollah. It disrupted the operational coordination mechanism that made the relationship functional. A new IRGC officer, even one with full access to the financial channels and the operational directives, does not automatically possess the specific personal credibility with Hezbollah's command structure that the eliminated relationship holder had built over 30 years. That credibility is not transferable. It dies with the person who held it. The same logic applies to the Houthi relationship, the Iraqi militia relationships, the various Syria-based proxy structures. The IRGC's axis of resistance was not an organizational chart. It was a human network built on personal relationships. Ghost Strike did not just damage the financial infrastructure that supported that network. It killed the people whose personal relationships made the network operational. Let us be precise about what this means for the deal that was announced and what its implementation requires. The deal's proxy stand-down provision requires the IRGC to direct Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the Iraqi militias to end operations against third parties. The diplomatic assumption embedded in that provision is that the IRGC's direction transmitted through its command channels will be received by the proxy organizations and implemented. That assumption was accurate when the IRGC's command channels were intact and the relationship networks that gave IRGC direction operational credibility were functional. Ghost Strike changed both conditions. The Houthis' last drone stockpile is being expended not because the IRGC directed continued operations. It is being expended because the supply chain that would have replenished that stockpile ran through IRGC logistics networks. IRGC channels being severed. The Iraqi militias are pulling back from field operations, not because they received a stand-down directive. They are pulling back because no funding has arrived and no operational direction is reaching them through channels that now lead to destroyed command nodes. The deal's proxy stand-down provision is being implemented by default through operational reality rather than through institutional compliance. This is precisely the outcome that Ghost Strike was designed to produce. Now, understand the fuller picture of what has been built since March 2026 that makes the deal's provisions achievable in a way that previous diplomatic frameworks were not. The bypass infrastructure around the Strait of Hormuz that has been constructed since the beginning of the conflict is the permanent transformation that Energy Secretary Wright described with the specific accuracy that the situation warrants. The Hormuz card is a card you can play once, Wright assessed, because the bypass infrastructure being built since the closure will permanently reduce Hormuz's strategic leverage regardless of what any deal says. The UAE's Habshan Fujairah pipeline at 1.9 million barrels per day. The Saudi Petroline at 7 million barrels per day capacity through Yanbu. These are physical infrastructure achievements that do not unbuild themselves when a ceasefire is announced. Without transiting Hormuz is the long-range economic weapon that reduces Iran's future leverage in any energy confrontation. Iran's ability to threaten Hormuz as a tool of coercion depended on Hormuz being irreplaceable. The bypass infrastructure, India's decision to shell its Chabahar investment and sign a new contract with the UAE's Fujairah alternative is the specific. Economic physics of the conflict became apparent. India was Iran's most significant Asian partner for the Plan B port. India walked away and signed with the UAE's Hormuz bypassing alternative. The strategic narrative of Chabahar as Iran's insurance policy against Hormuz closure is not diminished, it is eliminated. India's signature on the Fujairah contract is the specific institutional confirmation that the partners whose participation made Chabahar strategically meaningful have recalculated their positions in light of what Ghost Strike and the naval blockade achieved together. Iran has no Plan C. This is not rhetorical. It is the operational conclusion that flows from the specific sequence of events that the intelligence, the cyber operations, the B-2 deliveries, the naval enforcement, and the economic pressure have collectively produced. The underground command infrastructure, whose depth was supposed to make it invulnerable, has been penetrated by the GBU-57. The communications infrastructure, whose redundancy was supposed to ensure operational continuity, has been severed by Cyber Command. The proxy network, whose financial lifeline was supposed to maintain regional deterrence, has been defunded by the blockade's revenue denial. The senior commander corps, whose personal relationships made the proxy network functional, has been systematically eliminated. The bypass infrastructure that was supposed to be impossible to build quickly enough to matter has been built quickly enough to matter. The resistance economy mythology sustained 47 years of institutional identity, precisely because previous pressure instruments left alternatives intact. Sanctions left shadow fleet pathways. Diplomacy left the IRGC inner circle able to filter external pressure from the decision authority. Limited military strikes created martyrdom narratives that the mythology could absorb. Ghost Strike was different in the specific dimension that matters. It was physical. It reached underground. It severed communications before commanders could coordinate a response. It eliminated the people whose decisions made the organization function. It created operational facts that the resistance mythology cannot absorb, because the resistance mythology is a narrative, and the operational facts are buildings that no longer stand and commanders who no longer give orders. Now, let us talk about Ahmad again, and Mariam, and the 90 million people whose daily lives are organized around an institutional infrastructure whose command layer has been systematically removed. Ahmad's logistics company stopped receiving payment from the IRGC-affiliated construction projects it supplied in early March 2026, not because of a policy change, because the command node that authorized payment was gone, and the replacement command node was trying to understand what its institutional authority was in a succession environment where no one had clear authority over anything. Ahmad stopped receiving his salary. Farideh, his wife, began carefully rationing the food in their apartment. Their children noticed that the meals had changed. Children always notice when the meals change. They do not understand the strategic calculation that produced the change. They understand only that dinner is smaller than it was last month. Mariam eventually reached Reza by phone when the communications infrastructure was partially restored. He was alive. He was in a barracks outside Tehran waiting for orders that were not coming through the channels that normally delivered them. He told her he was fine. He did not tell her that he did not know who he now reported to, because his commanding officer was dead and the officer above that officer was also dead. And the institutional chain of command that normally tells a military organization who is in charge had been disrupted in ways that were still being sorted out. Mariam told him to come home when he could. He said he would try. The political consequences of Ghost Strike inside Iran are not separate from its military consequences. They are the same. Consequences experienced at different institutional levels. At the command level, the consequence is the elimination of the senior leadership core that made the organization function. At the financial level, the consequence is the revenue denial that defunded the proxy network and began eroding the subsidy system that bought domestic social peace. At the street level, the consequence is Ahmad's smaller dinner and Miriam's sleepless night, and the specific material suffering that is experienced not as geopolitical calculation, but as the daily reality of a family trying to understand why things that used to work have stopped working. The Supreme National Security Council's leaked assessment that described unrest as inevitable in its timing rather than uncertain in its occurrence is the most honest institutional document the Iranian security apparatus has produced because it acknowledges what the operational arithmetic requires. The blockade tolerance was measured in 6 to 8 weeks. The private sector jobs being lost numbered nearly 2 million by end of spring. The rial plunging to 1.8 million against the dollar. Inflation exceeding 40% annually. The president going on national television to tell his people to turn off 8 of their 10 lamps. These are not abstract economic statistics. They are the specific conditions under which 90 million people are trying to live, and the specific arithmetic that produces the SNSC's assessment that the population's tolerance for continued economic collapse has an expiration date that the blockade's timeline is approaching. Ghost Strike created the military conditions that made the economic pressure possible. A naval blockade without the military superiority to enforce it is a declaration, not an enforcement. The IRGC's capacity to threaten vessels enforcing the blockade, to mine the strait, to direct proxy attacks that raise the cost of enforcement, to maintain the credible military deterrence that gives an adversary reason to negotiate rather than enforce, was the specific institutional capability that Ghost Strike targeted. When the IRGC's command infrastructure is eliminated, when its senior commanders are killed, when its communications are severed, when its missile batteries are destroyed and its naval assets are sunk and its proxy networks are defunded and its underground bunkers are obliterated by weapons that reach 200 feet into reinforced concrete, the capacity to threaten the enforcement of a blockade is reduced to a level that U.S. Marines, fast roping from helicopters onto tanker decks, can manage. The 567,000 barrels per day that Iran was exporting 2 weeks after the blockade began in earnest, down from 1.85 million barrels per day before the conflict, is the specific revenue collapse that flows from Ghost Strike's military achievements. The IRGC that would have directed the Shadow Fleet evasion operations, the ship-to-ship transfers in the Strait of Malacca, the flag of convenience registry operations, the shell company ownership structures that disguised Iranian tanker ownership, no longer had the command infrastructure to coordinate those operations with its previous sophistication. The institutional capacity for sophisticated sanctions? Evasion requires institutional coordination. Ghost Strike disrupted the coordination. The revenue collapsed. The $13 billion monthly oil revenue became approximately $4 billion. The financial foundation of the proxy network, the domestic subsidy system, the social contract that bought 90 million people's acceptance of a government many of them did not choose, began collapsing at the pace that the SNSC's own leaked assessment documented. This is the specific mechanism through which an operational plan executed in the first 45 seconds of a military campaign determines the outcome of the larger conflict that follows. Not by ending the conflict in those 45 seconds, by creating the operational conditions in those 45 seconds that make every subsequent phase of the conflict unwinnable for the adversary who did not understand or did not believe that the weapons and the intelligence architecture that deliver them had reached the specific capability threshold that made their underground refuge reachable. The IRGC built its command infrastructure to survive everything that American air power had previously delivered. The GBU-57 was specifically engineered to reach what American air power had previously been unable to reach. The IRGC maintained electronic silence to prevent targeting intelligence from characterizing its facilities. Cyber Command penetrated the networks that enforced that silence and used the access to both collect the targeting intelligence and then sever the communications infrastructure at the moment the kinetic weapons arrived. The IRGC built redundant command paths to ensure operational continuity under attack. Ghost Strike addressed those command paths simultaneously across multiple target complexes in the opening operational period, rather than sequentially over days that would have allowed the surviving nodes to reconstitute. The petroleum engineering clock that the Kepler Research Maritime Intelligence firm documented produced the deal's announcement. The blockade's revenue denial produced the economic collapse that the SNSC characterized in its leaked assessment as inevitably producing social unrest. The proxy network's financial collapse produced the operational stand-down that the deal's provisions required. The bypass infrastructure's construction produced the permanent reduction in Hormuz's strategic leverage that removed the IRGC's most powerful future coercion instrument. All of it traces back to that first 45 seconds. To the cyber disruption that blinded the IRGC before the bombs arrived. To the B-2s that launched from Whiteman and arrived over Tehran before any warning could be transmitted. To the GBU-57s that burrowed through 200 feet of reinforced concrete and obliterated the facilities that were supposed to be too deep to reach. The man who went to sleep believing he was protected was Mohammed Pakpour. He commanded the organization that built the underground cities and maintained the electronic silence and invested tens of billions in the specific infrastructure that was supposed to make the depth of the hole the answer to the precision of the weapon. The deal was announced on Memorial Day weekend. The uranium is leaving. The proxy network's last drone stockpile is expended. The lights went out across Iranian cities not as a metaphor, but as a specific material condition that the president of the country reported to his own people in a national broadcast instruction to sit in the dark. The depth of the hole was not the answer. The weapon that reaches 200 feet into reinforced concrete does not care about the depth of the hole. The communications network that was supposed to coordinate the response was severed before the response could be transmitted. The institutional knowledge that was supposed to allow the organization to adapt was in the facilities that the B-2s reached in the first 45 seconds. The resistance economy mythology survived 47 years of sanctions and diplomacy and limited military pressure because those instruments left the physical infrastructure of defiance intact. Ghost Strike addressed the physical infrastructure. The geology of reinforced concrete does not negotiate with ideology. The physics of a 30,000-pound penetrating warhead does not care about the revolutionary narrative. The wall of the bunker holds or it does not hold. It did not hold. And somewhere in the specific silence that replaced the voice of every IRGC commander who did not wake up on the morning of February 28th, the deal that 47 years of every other instrument could not produce was already being calculated. Not because the IRGC chose wisdom over defiance, because Ghost Strike removed the physical infrastructure that made continued defiance an option. And without that infrastructure, the resistance mythology is exactly what physics says it is: a story. And a 30,000-pound weapon traveling through 200 feet of reinforced concrete at terminal velocity does not read stories. The deal is on the table, the uranium is leaving, and the hole in the ground where the command center used to be is the specific monument to what happens when 20 years of underground construction meets the weapon that was designed specifically to reach it. Not a sanction, a bunker buster. And concrete does not care about mythology either.